So now to our speaker. And I will just tell you this, as many of you might have known, Senator Andrew Zwiker, who also works for the Princeton Plasma Lab, was scheduled to speak and got called away 2 days ago by the General Assembly for doing a vote, which they're voting on right now. And he was backed up by an amazing individual, David Gates. Dr. Gates is a stellarator, physics leader at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. David received his PhD in plasma physics from Columbia University in 1993. He spent 4 years in the Cohen Laboratory near Oxford, England. Since then, he's worked at PP&L in various roles, including managing development of the control system for the National Spherical Torus Experiment. How many know what that is? Oh, there we go. Yep, thank you, Kristen. David is an expert in magnetohydrodynamics, the study of magnetized conducting fluids, and is the author of more than 150 scholarly papers, and was elected a Fellow of the American Physical Society in 2013. His current research interests are focused on establishing the stellarator device, which I know we'll learn more about, as a viable solution to the fusion energy and explain the physics of the density limits in tomac devices. So this should be one of our more interesting lunches. David?
So, yeah, I had to step in at the last minute for Andrew, who got called away to emergency political activities. So if the talk is confused or incoherent, it's his fault. My name's David Gates. I am, as was just announced, a physicist at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which, by the way, is just through the woods behind this hotel. In fact, this hotel was the first hotel I ever stayed at in Princeton, so and that was longer ago than I will tell you. I grew up in the Midwest, and I moved. I went to school in New York City, and I lived in quite a few places all over the world. And the last 20 years, I've been here in Princeton, and it's really a pleasure to be here to address this august body of community leaders. So PPL, I'm going to tell you today about Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, about fusion research, about government-funded research in general and how that helps drive investments in the community, and talk to you a little bit about energy in general as an idea, like where do we need to go with energy research in this country, and some of the problems we face as we go forward. So, what's fusion? Fusion is the opposite of fission. If you know what nuclear power is, where you take a big atom and you break it in half, that makes energy. It turns out if you take two small atoms and shove them together, you also get energy. You actually get a lot more energy per atom with fusion than you do with fission. Fusion is what makes the sun hot. So it works. There's not any question that happens. So why do we care about fusion? Fusion is actually a really hard technical problem. Fusion doesn't happen because, fusion only happens at very high energy, and the reason for that is if I have two little nuclei and I want to smash them together, they're electrically charged and they repel each other. So in order to get them to overcome the barrier and stick together, I need to have the particles have a lot of energy. So we typically heat the fusion reactor, the gas in the fusion reactor, to 100 million degrees. Yeah, that's not easy to do. In fact, it's hard to even know if something's 100 million degrees because you can't use a thermometer, right? There's no thermometer that can withstand that environment. Typically, actually, if you tried to put a thermometer, it would actually cool the plasma more than it would heat it. So why do we want to do it? It's a really hard problem. The reason is simple. Fusion is carbon-free power without long-lived nuclear waste. Okay? There isn't really anything like that. I think most of the people at where I work are very much in favor of alternative energy sources. But if you look at the ones that look really viable, like wind and solar, they're pulsed. The wind stops blowing, the sun goes down. And you want to leave your fridge on all day. You don't want your fridge to be off at night because the food's not any good in the morning. And that's a big issue. So fusion provides an alternative to regular nuclear power because the waste product, where two atoms stick together, we use hydrogen. We use isotopes of hydrogen, which is pretty available. The ocean is full of it. So after they stick together, it makes helium. And helium is an inert gas. It's not radioactive. You can inhale it. If you do, you talk like a duck. So that's why we want to do it. Why haven't we done it yet? Because it's really difficult to heat something up to 100 million degrees and have it not do damage to the thing it's in. So when I say damage, I mean like erode little pieces off the wall and put the plasma out. That's typically what happens. So we want to do this goal. It's been happening at PPL. It was actually probably the first fusion research center in the world. The Russians started one, and there's some debate about it. It was all secret back then. So in fact, there was a Project Matterhorn, was a secret project on the Forrestal campus, started in the 1950s by Lyman Spitzer, who was also the father of the Hubble Space Telescope. So that's why we want to do it, and it's hard. So how do we do it? We want to make fusion. There's actually two approaches. One is to blast pellets with lasers. I'm not going to talk about that. It's not my area. It's done by people who like to blast things with lasers. We're DOE, they're DOD. We use magnetic fields. So when you make it something 100 million degrees centigrade, it's not solid, it's not a gas anymore. It heats up to the point where the electrons and the nuclei separate from each other and makes a thing called a plasma. So there's electrons flying around in free space and ions, and it's too hot for them to stick together. So we broke the chemical bonds that keep the atoms together, and now there's free electrons and free ions flying around. Now, at 100 million degrees, without something to prevent it, the particle will hit the wall and cool off really fast. Right? It takes just one collision, it's down to room temperature again. And that's pretty hard to beat. Particles move pretty fast. You're actually, I don't know if you know this, but you're being bombarded by particles going like 1 million meters a second all the time. So you have to have something to keep it off the wall. So we use a magnetic field. So we put a magnetic field. I'm actually not going to talk about stellars and tokamaks because they both do the same thing. Stellarators is one way of doing it, tokamaks is another. We use magnetic fields because charged particles follow magnetic field lines. So if you make a circular magnetic field, the charged particles can't get out, they don't hit the wall. And then we heat it up. We put it in a lot of power, and we try to make it to the point where it starts to sustain fusion, right? And we have actually done that. So in fact, Princeton, PPPL, was the first site to exceed 10 megawatts of fusion power. We made 10 megawatts of fusion power in a device called TFTR in 1996, I believe was the year. So that happened just a block from here, roughly. The Europeans have since gone to 20 megawatts, roughly. That was about the year or two after that. And that's where we stand right now. So where are we going now? So there's been a debate about the next step in fusion for about the last, actually my entire career. So, because the next step is a major endeavor. We want to build something on the scale of a reactor with technology that's never been tested. The cost is high. It's not cheap. It's, depending on which country you ask, the project that's being followed by now is between $20 to $40 billion. Okay? It's a big endeavor. In fact, so the object there's a reactor being built in the south of France. It's called ITER. ITER used to stand for the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor. It now just stands for ITER, which means the way in Latin. So it's not, we lost the acronym. The project was actually initiated by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 1986, which, by the way, coincidentally was my first year in grad school. Okay? So the project was politically designed to show that the US and the Soviet Union could work together. That motivation has since somewhat faded, since there's no Soviet Union anymore. But this idea, several other, Europe joined and Japan joined, and the project got to a certain point, and the US actually pulled out of this agreement. First off, the original motivation was gone. Second off, we were unhappy with where the Europeans were going, and there's lots of internal politics. But also, at the time, oil was just really cheap. And it was 1990s, and oil was at, I think I remember paying 89 cents a gallon for gas. So we pulled out, and we actually rejoined again a few years later. Also, interestingly, had nothing to do with the actual project itself. Tony Blair was being courted by George Bush to support the war in Iraq. And Tony Blair said, okay, but one of the things you have to do is rejoin here. So we're back in. This device is being built in the south of France right now. It's big. It's really big. It would not fit in this room. It would not fit probably in this building. It will make fusion energy. We will make 500 megawatts of fusion power for 400 seconds per try. The probability that that will work is very high. It was joined as, part of the reason it was made an international project beyond the political reasons was to spread out the risk over a larger funding base. So it's being funded by about 1/3 of the world's population, which includes China and India and Japan and Korea and Europe, the United States and Russia. So it's about 1/3 of the world's population is paying for this device in the south of France.